Hello students, welcome to today's lecture. So in this lecture, we are going to see about RESTful web services. So basically RESTful web services are based on REST architecture web-based services. So in REST architecture, everything is a resource. So RESTful web services are commonly used to create APIs for web-based applications. So in this lecture, we are going to learn about the RESTful web services. So this will help in understanding of RESTful web services concept and also how the network is connected. Okay. So let's go to the slide. So RESTful features, RESTful web services, which are basically a REST architecture. So representational state transfer architecture. So this is based on web services. So in REST architecture, everything is a resource. So these RESTful web services are lightweight, highly scalable and maintainable. So here the web services are very lightweight and highly just scalable and also easily maintainable. So and are very commonly used to create APIs for web-based applications. So these REST methods with RESTful features, which is a web standards which based on the architecture and also uses HTTP protocol. So it revolves around the resource where every component is a resource and a resource is accessed by a common interface using HTTP standards. So it was first introduced by Roy Fielding in 2000. So in REST architecture, the REST server, okay, it provides access to resources and REST client access and modifies the resources. So when all interactions which is used in applications which conformly are fully to the REST constraints, so that they are called as RESTful. So all the interactions in the applications which conform fully to the REST constraints. So these REST constraints under these applications are called as RESTful. So RESTful APIs which comply with these constraints. So and thus conform to the REST architecture style. So when web services with RESTful API which adhere to the REST architectural constraints. So REST architectural constraints. So REST architectural constraints are realized by applying specific interaction constraints to data elements, components and connectors with the objects. So REST constraints which are listed as uniform interface and stateless, cacheable, client-server interaction, layered system, code on demand. So these REST architectural constraints are adhere with the RESTful APIs. So RESTful methods. So REST architecture style which can be used for HTTP access. So through HTTP access with the help of that verbs called get, post, put and delete methods. So these are the methods which are used in RESTful APIs. So for resource and building web services. So RESTful web services which makes use of the HTTP protocols as a communication medium. So between the client and the server. So the client which sends the message in the form of HTTP request and the server responds in the form of HTTP response. So here the request response model comes into picture. So this technique is termed as messaging. So these messages contains the message data and metadata, that is the information about message itself. So it has both the message data and also the information about the message. So RESTful HTTP APIs. So standard HTTP methods are get, put, post and delete. So these HTTP based RESTful APIs which is use the following for RESTful API connections. So this URIs and URLs and then REST based web objects, that is a uniform resource identifier and uniform resource locator. So URL and URIs such as http weathermessage.com for getting a weather message and hypertext links to reference state and reference related resources and also JSON. So Java string object notations are an internet media type. So MIME type. So these are called as hypertext links. So with the help of URIs and URLs, This is one of the method followed by the RESTful architecture through HTTP method. So next one, REST based web objects, that is which typically communicate but not always over the HTTP. So the Wide Web itself represents the largest implementation of a system which conforming to the REST architectural styles. And also RESTful HTTP system feature is that the communication is over the HTTP and use the verbs such as commands, same as in HTTP, like get, post, put and delete. So HTTP request. So the request has 5 things. So first one verb, second one URI, third one HTTP version, fourth one request header, and fifth one request body. So here the verb indicates the HTTP methods, type of methods. Okay. So REST interfaces usually involve resource repositories with identifiers. For example, device network, so which can be operated using standard verbs. So these standard verbs are get, post, delete, put, etc. So with URI, uniform resource identifier, to identify the where the particular resource is available on the server. So here the HTTP version indicates the type of version. So for example, HTTP version 1.1. So request header, it contains the metadata. So information about the data itself is called metadata. So HTTP for the request which contains the metadata for the HTTP request message as key value pairs. So in terms of key value pairs, it contains the metadata. So for example, a client which is a browser, type, format supported by the client or formats of the message body or the cache settings. So request header which contains the data about information about the message. Okay. So next one, request body, the message content or resource representation. So this is the HTTP request model type which is from the client end. So next to the response end which is from the server end. So here the these 4 indicates the HTTP response. First one status represent code, and another one HTTP version, and then response header followed by response body. Okay. So it response code which indicates the server status for the requested resource. For example, here the HTTP response which covers 4 important things, that is status or response code, HTTP version, response header, response body. So here the status or response code which indicates the server status for the requested resource. So for example, if the client sends a particular request to the server, so it has to give the status. So return back the status for that particular request. So for example, if the request means okay, so it will send the number as 200. So 200 means response is okay. So if there is any error, so if it can't able to fetch the data means 404. So that error which tells about the resource not found. So this is the response code from the server side. So it also uses HTTP version which indicates HTTP version, for example HTTP 1.1. So response header, it contains the metadata, so information about the data itself. So for the HTTP response message as key value pairs. So for example, content length, content type, and then response data and server type. So response body which contains the message content or source representation. So this is all about the request response model. So HTTP verbs, so REST interfaces which usually involves resource repositories with identifiers. So for example, it is having a device network or device or temperature app which can be operated using these standard verbs. So get means it provides a read-only access to a resource. So particular resource. Post means it used to create a new resource. Okay. So delete means it uses to remove the resource, and put means it used to update a existing resource or create a new resource. A web service which is a collection of open protocols and standards which is used for exchanging data between applications and systems. So software applications which written in various programming languages and running on various platforms which can be useful web services to exchange data over the computer networks. So like internet, which is in a manner which is similar to a inter-process communication on a single network. So this is called interoperability. So for example, between Java, Python or Windows and Linux applications is because of the open standards. So this RESTful web services are open. It is a collection of open protocols. Okay, so web services based on REST architecture, which is known as RESTful web services. So these web services uses these HTTP methods to implement the concept of REST architecture. So RESTful web services usually define a URI, uniform resource identifier, as a service, and provides a resource representation with using JSON, JavaScript object notation, and also a set of HTTP methods. So for creating a RESTful web services, so these are all the methods. For user services, get the post body is empty, which shows the list of all users for getting the values using the get. So user service add user. So you have to post the message, means with the help of JSON string, we add the details of new user. So in the user ID, which get user ID means using a get. So get with the post body as empty, which shows the detail of the user. Okay. So if after adding that, we can look into the details. So this is the creating a RESTful web services. So resource in the as already told that REST architecture treats every content as a resource. So these resources can be a text files or HTML pages or images or videos or dynamic business data. So REST server simply provides access to the resource, and the REST client access and modifies the resource. So this is the simple concept of REST architecture. Here each resource is identified by the particular URLs and global IDs. So the REST uses various representations to represent a resource where text, JSON or XML. So the most popular representations of resources are XML and JSON. So here the representation of resource, a resource in the REST is similar to object in object oriented programming. So or like an entity in database. So once the resource is identified, then it is representation is decided to be using a standard format, so that the server can send the resource in the format, and also client can understand the resource in the same format. For example, in RESTful web services, so which uses a user in the name of ID and the name which specified as a name and his profession. So the same resource can be can be represented in JSON. So with the help of ID1, for example, ID1, his name is Magesh and his profession is teacher. Okay, so this is a concept in JSON RESTful web services. So good resources representation. So REST does not impose any restriction in the format of resource representation. So here the good source of representation. So REST does not impose any restriction on the format of a resource representation. So a client which can ask for JSON representation, whereas another client which can ask for XML representation of the same resource to the server, and so on. So it is the responsibility of the REST server to pass the client the resource in the format that the client can understand. So whatever it may be the representation or whatever it may be the source. Okay. Here the REST does not impose any restriction on the format of resource representation. For example, a client which can ask for JSON representation, or some client which may ask for XML representation of the same resource to the server. So it is a responsibility of the REST server to pass the client the resource which is the format that the client can understand. So this is the responsibility of the REST server. So whatever it may be the representation, the REST server has to pass the client with the resource format. Okay. So for the better understanding of client. So following are the important points which is to be designing a representation format of a resource in RESTful web services. So first thing is that understandability. Second thing is completeness, and third one is linkability. So understandability, both the server and client should be able to understand and utilize the representation format of the resource. So second thing is that completeness. So format should be able to represent a resource completely. Okay. So for example, a resource which can contain another resource. So the format should be able to represent simple as well as complex structure of resources. So third one is linkability. So resources which can have a linkage to another resource. So a format should be able to handle such situation. So the present web services which are representing resource using either XML or JSON format. So there are plenty of libraries and tools which is available to understand, parse and modify XML and JSON data. So the RESTful web services in part understanding. So the constructing a standard URI, that is a uniform resource identifier. So the points which are to be noted is use plural noun and avoid using spaces and use lowercase addresses and maintain backward compatibility and using HTTP verb. So using of plural noun to define resources. For example, we have used users to identify as users as a resource. So avoid using the spaces, that is use underscore or hyphen when using a long resource. For example, use authorized hyphen or underscore users instead of authorized space users. Okay, so space is automatically taken as a %20 symbol. Okay, so and letters. So use lowercase letters. Although URI is a case insensitive, it is a good practice to keep the URL in lowercase letters only. So and maintain backward compatibility. So as web services is a public service, URL once made public should be always available. Okay, so in case URI get updated, which redirect the older URI to a new URI using the HTTP status code as 300. So if that any updation, it is automatically reached to the new URI. Okay. So next one, using HTTP verb. So always use HTTP verb like get, put, delete to the operations on the resource. So it is not good to use operations name in the URI. Okay. So HTTP methods for having a RESTful web services. So get get the list of users. Operation is type is read only. So and then for get user ID of 1, you have to use the letter as 1, number as 1. Okay. So on post, so insert user with ID 2. So it is operation type is non-idempotent. So third one, put. So put is update user with ID 2. For example, HTTP local post, user management, user services, users 2. So there is no operation type. So delete the user ID with ID 1. So its operation type is idempotent. So options head. So it is a read only operation type. It supports the list the supported operations in a web services. So it returns only HTTP header, no body of the content. So the important points to be considered is get operations are read only or safe. So put and delete operations are idempotent. That means the result will always same no matter how many times these operations are invoked. Okay. So this is called, it is operation type as idempotent. So next one, the put and post operations which are nearly same with the difference lying only in the result, where put operation is idempotent and post operation can cause different result. So this is the important points to be considered in RESTful web services and their methods. So next one, statelessness. So as per the REST architecture, RESTful web services should not keep client state on the server. So this restriction is called statelessness. So it is a responsibility of the client to pass it contents to the server, and then the server can store this context to process the client's further request. So for example, a session maintained by the server is identified by session identifier, which is passed by the client. So RESTful web services should adhere to these restrictions. So advantages of this statelessness is so web services can treat each method request independently. Okay. So web services need not maintain the client's previous interactions. It simplifies the application design. So and then as HTTP itself is a statelessness protocol. So it is not a stateful protocol, it is a statelessness protocol. So RESTful web services work seamlessly within the HTTP protocol. So the only disadvantage is web services need to get extra information in each request, and also it has to interpret to get the client state in case of the client interactions. Okay, so this is the usefulness of statelessness application of RESTful web services. So coming to the security, so a RESTful web services work with HTTP URL paths. So it is very important to safeguard a RESTful web services in a same manner as a website is secured. Okay, so the important points to be considered is validation, session based authentication, no sensitive data in the URL, a restriction on method execution, validate malformed XML or JSON through genetic error messages. So if the validation part, so it has to validate all the inputs on the server. So protect that HTTP URI in the server against SQL or no SQL injection attacks. So session based authentication uses to authenticate a user whenever a request is made to a web service method. So no sensitive data, that like never use username, password or session token in a URL. So these values should be passed to web service through post method. So restriction on method execution. So allow restricted use of methods like get, post and delete methods. The get method should not able to delete the data. Okay, so the whatever it may be the function has to be seamlessly done by the particular verb or a method. Okay. So the validate malformed, so it checks for well formed input passed to a web service method. So generic error messages, so web services should use HTTP error message like 403 to show access forbidden. Okay, so some HTTP codes and descriptions are first one is that 200. Okay, so it shows that request response is success. So 201 is created when a resource is successfully created using post or put request. So it returns links to the newly created resource using the location header. So 204 is no content, where when a response body is empty, for example a delete request. So 304, it is a not modified. See, it is used to reduce network bandwidth usage in case of conditional get request. So response body should be empty, headers should have date and location. So for 400 means bad request. So that is states that as an invalid input is provided, for example a validation error or missing data. So 401 is unauthorized. So that states that the user is using invalid or wrong authentication token. So 403 is forbidden. So states that the user is not having access to the method being used. For example, delete access without admin rights. So 404 is not found. So we commonly see the when you are connected, the net is disconnected means the error will be coming like 404, the net not found. Okay, so it states that the method is not available. So 409 is a conflict. So it states conflict situation while executing the method for example adding duplicate entry. So it is a conflict. So 500 means internal server error. So it states that the server has thrown some exception while executing the method. So these are all the different HTTP codes and description. So next coming to the advantages. So web services can treat each method request independently. So whatever may be the formatting, either in JSON or XML format, so the web services can each treat each method request independently. So web services which need not to be maintain the client's previous interaction. So it simplifies the application design, and also as it HTTP is itself a statelessness protocol. So RESTful web services work seamlessly with the HTTP protocol. So these are all the advantages of using RESTful services.